I think the thing to start with is the field of biotechnology. And biotechnology at a high level just means engineered biology, specifically engineering genetic code to change the way biology behaves. So that's sort of the field of biotechnology. And the biotech kind of dates back to sort of the late 70s, early 80s. The first true biotech company was this company called Genentech, which was a company that developed this way to engineer E. coli, which is a type of bacteria, to make insulin. Before this, insulin was derived from pigs, basically. So they had to
Literally
process,
suck the insulin out of the pig
pretty
with like
much
a needle or something.
Well, yeah,
Or
the pigs were dead.
Like,
The pigs,
sure.
the pigs were dead. So they just collected tons and tons of pig pancreases from a slaughterhouse, and then processed those to make very small amounts of insulin for human use for diabetes. So Genentech figured out how to engineer, basically piece together a little piece of DNA, put it into a bacterial cell, and that DNA coded for human insulin. So that was the first sort of biotech product that ever came to market, I think sometime in the 80s or early 80s. From there, this field continued to grow, and the leading edge of biotech and ultimately biomanufacturing was really biopharma for a number of decades. So drug development in particular was sort of the area where there was the greatest utility and greatest value seen by the market over the course of 10, 20 years. But the technology underlying it became kind of more widely available and started to disseminate through various industries. So this technology of engineering genetic code to produce a protein or to modify a organism to do something started to be applied in other areas. So you have things like biofuels. So biofuels are made with biomanufacturing. You have things like probiotics, which are healthy microbes that are used in food and nutrition. So these engineered living systems kind of propagated out through various industries, and the field of biomanufacturing is sort of an umbrella term for using these engineered organisms to manufacture products of value to humanity in some way.
The dumb version of that explanation that I give people when they ask me, I'll tell you, and I want to know if it's actually correct, because I'm not sure if it is. I might be spreading disinformation.
Okay.
So I give the analogy of, you know how beer is made in these big old vats, and it's basically yeast, which are living organisms. The yeast, as they eat the sugar, they excrete alcohol, more or less. And biomanufacturing is basically, what if we genetically modify the yeast or the E. coli or some other microorganism to, instead of alcohol, excrete something else that we want? Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, that's more or less correct. In that instance, you're using a biological system to make something that you want, in particular, like a single cell biological system. So there you're making beer, but in today's sort of modern biomanufacturing, you're engineering these systems to make a whole wide range of different products. Very, from a high level, it looks very similar to beer brewing from a distance.
And I guess the next question then is, okay, if it's possible to create these products by genetically engineering some sort of microorganism to make it for you as a byproduct of its growth, like why do that versus just, whatever the alternative is, like some chemist in a lab with test tubes mixing chemicals around? Why can't you just create it like that way? Why do you have to genetically engineer some microorganism to make it for you?
Yeah. I think the first reason, which is maybe the best reason, is that biology is really good at making super complicated things. So biology, if you just kind of look at the living world around us, is capable of making extremely complex things, including human brains.
Sure.
So there's a huge class of compounds that potentially only biology can make. So I guess that's sort of one answer. The other answer is that, maybe there's a few others, but at least one other is that you can start with a very simple feedstock like sugar and turn it into really complicated and valuable things in a pretty safe and innocuous way using biology. So there's very few hazardous chemicals required. It's generally a kind of a safe way to make chemicals, as opposed to a lot of other chemical manufacturing.
Yeah, like in the case of beer, you're literally just feeding them sugar and then you get this valuable alcohol. Yeah. And I imagine that most of the other biomanufacturing processes also some relatively simple input like sugar or some sort of fructose or something that the microbes can eat. Whereas if you were making it in a lab, you would need like some sort of petrochemical thing that might be explosive or might be toxic and just really hard and cumbersome.
Yeah, and that's the other sort of adjacent point is that if we are trying to get away from using solely petrochemicals as precursors for all of these processes, then biology is a good way to do it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and the other point that you made is that there are some things that are just only possible to be made, or at least it's much easier to make them in this biomanufactured way versus the traditional kind of petrochemical synthesis, just because nature has this way of being able to synthesize really complex molecules. By the way, from what I understand, insulin is quite a complex molecule. If you actually like pull up a picture of insulin, you look at it and it's like, whoa, I don't know how any person can synthesize that.
Yeah, and that was sort of why Genentech had to use a microbe to make insulin because they couldn't have synthesized it chemically. It would have been way too complicated.
So if it has those advantages, how come everything isn't made with biomanufacturing then? What are the downsides?
Yeah. I think the sort of obvious thing to say is cost. The first products that came out, like I said, were drugs, and those are very valuable products, probably on the order of $1 million a kilogram for maybe not insulin itself, but some of these biologic drugs, for example, that are currently made using biomanufacturing. They're very, very, very valuable. So the sort of juice is worth the squeeze in terms of manufacturing cost. For many other products that are low value, commodity, huge markets that you could point to, using petrochemicals as a feedstock is the right path, at least today, because petrochemicals are extremely cheap and widespread.
So you talk about the cost. I mean, what part of it is expensive? Is it doing the research to figure out how to engineer the microbe? Is that the expensive part, or is there another part that's expensive?
Yeah, engineering the microbe is definitely complex and can take a fair bit of time. But if you do find one or you do engineer one that works, then you can kind of amortize that over the course of 10, 20, 50 years of production.
Sure. Yeah, once you figure it out, it's going to work forever.
It's kind of like R&D around a drug where, if you get that R&D done, your trial's done, then you can just make it and you have your patent protection for whatever it is, 20 years. I think a bigger factor, there's a number of factors that go into it. For sure, feedstock is one. Like there is some floor on the cost of sugar. Sugar's not too expensive. We're fortunate here in the U.S. because we do produce a lot of sugar. So nominally our sugar should be relatively low price. There are places with lower price sugar, but feedstock is like part of the floor of the price of any given thing. If you're spending $1, if you're buying sugar for $1 for every kilogram, then your thing better be worth more than $1.
Sure. Got to feed those microbes some highly subsidized high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah, exactly.
Get those prices down.
Yeah. Which is, again, I think one of the reasons that, nominally the U.S. should be leading in biotech is because we do have great natural resources to feed to these microbes. Lots of corn. So feedstock is one thing. Sort of our thesis, and we can get into kind of what my company Biosphere is doing, is that the infrastructure itself is far too expensive, both from a CapEx and an OpEx perspective. So the physical facilities, the operational overhead, the labor, to adequately sort of meet the needs of a lot of these new markets. So basically building biomanufacturing facilities and operating them is very costly. Now, it's also very costly to build a oil and gas refinery.
Right.
But that industry has been around for 100 years and has had a lot of time to eke out efficiency, and they're also really, really, really large.
So part of the reason why it hasn't taken off more is just because it's a more recent industry versus traditional chemical manufacturing.
Yeah, there's definitely a level of
kind of just like an
industry maturity
advantage kind of thing.
Yeah, and up until recently, there weren't really a lot sort of incentives to try to bring the cost down because the focus was mostly on products that were relatively high value, like these drugs.